Good evening, friends. Today, we'll drift into a slow and gentle journey through ancient Greek legends and quiet historical moments that time almost forgot. These are the stories whispered in marble halls, shared by shepherds under starlit skies, and passed down through generations of dreamers. Dim your lights, settle under your blanket, let the noise of the day fade away like mist over the Aegean Sea. And if this calm journey helps you relax, feel free to tap like and subscribe only if it feels right. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight and tell me what time it is in your city right now. Are you watching as the sun sets over your hometown? Or perhaps as the first stars appear? It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, sharing this quiet moment together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's begin our journey to ancient Greece, where even the gods sometimes needed a good night's sleep. You've probably heard about Pandora's box, that famous container that released all the troubles of the world when curiosity got the better of humanity's first woman. But tonight, let's slow down and explore what really happened in those quiet moments before everything changed forever. Picture a small stone cottage on the hills outside what would someday become Athens. The morning light filters through wooden shutters, creating gentle patterns on clay walls. Pandora sits at her simple wooden table, running her fingers along the smooth bronze surface of a box that seems to hum with an energy she can't quite understand. She's been staring at this box for 3 days now, 3 long, quiet days of wondering. The gods gave it to her as a wedding gift, or so they said. Zeus himself had smiled that practiced smile of his and placed it in her hands with a warning that felt more like a dare. Never open this, dear Pandora. Promise me you'll never open this. But here's what the stories never tell you about those days of waiting. Pandora wasn't just fighting curiosity. She was fighting loneliness. Her husband, Epimetheus, worked in the olive groves from sunrise to sunset, his hands growing rough and brown from handling branches and checking the soil. When he came home, he was too tired for much conversation. He'd eat his bread and olives, maybe mention the weather or a neighbor's goat, then fall asleep to the sound of crickets chirping in the garden. They were still learning to live and tend together, so Pandora would sit with the box. She'd trace its intricate engravings with her fingertip spirals that seemed to move when she wasn't looking at them directly. Faces of creatures she couldn't quite identify, symbols that felt familiar, even though she was sure she'd never seen them before. Sometimes late at night, when Epimetheus was snoring softly on their simple bed, she thought she could hear something inside the box. Not voices exactly, but something like whispers, like the sound of wind through leaves, or water trickling over stones, or perhaps the distant laughter of children playing a game she couldn't quite remember. On the morning of the 4th day, something changed. Pandora woke before dawn, as she often did, and walked to the small window that looked out over the valley. The world was wrapped in that particular kind of silence that comes just before the birds start singing, when everything feels possible and nothing has gone wrong yet. She made her simple breakfast. Bread that Epimetheus had bartered for in the village, honey from their neighbors' bees, and water from the spring that bubbled up behind their house. But as she ate, she kept glancing at the box. Today it looked different somehow. The bronze seemed warmer, almost alive. And those whispers she thought she'd been imagining, they were definitely there now, soft but unmistakable. "We know you're listening," they seemed to say. "We know you understand." Pandora set down her bread and walked slowly to the table where the box waited. "What do you want?" she whispered, feeling a little foolish for talking to an object, but somehow knowing it was the right thing to do. The response wasn't words exactly, but images that formed in her mind. She saw herself as the gods had made her, shaped from clay and water, given breath and consciousness, blessed with gifts from each of the immortals. Athena had given her wisdom. Aphrodite had given her beauty. Hermes had given her curiosity and the ability to speak persuasively. But what none of the stories mention is what Hera gave her, the ability to sense when something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. And standing there in her small kitchen, with early morning light beginning to creep across the floor, Pandora suddenly understood that the box wasn't full of evils waiting to escape. It was full of truths that someone didn't want the world to know. Her hands trembled as she reached for the small bronze clasp that held the lid closed, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of realization. The gods hadn't given her this box as a test of obedience. They'd given it to her because they knew she was the only one brave enough to open it when the time was right. The clasp was warm under her fingers, almost alive. As she began to lift it, she could hear Epimetheus stirring in the bedroom, probably awakening to another day of simple, honest work in the groves. She paused for a moment, thinking about the life they had, quiet, peaceful, unmarked by the complexities that seemed to plague the gods and their endless dramas. Part of her wanted to set the box aside, to pretend she'd never heard those whispers, to spend her days learning to bake better bread and tend a proper garden. But the whispers were growing stronger now, and she could make out individual voices. They weren't evil at all. They were sad, lonely. They'd been trapped for so long, carrying truths that needed to be shared. One voice in particular caught her attention, softer than the others, but somehow more urgent. "I am hope," it said. "And I've been waiting for you, Pandora. The world will need me most of all." That's when she understood. The box didn't contain evil. It contained everything that makes life real: pain and loss, yes, but also courage and hope, and the kind of love that grows stronger when tested. The gods had kept these things locked away because they wanted humans to remain simple and obedient, never growing beyond what their creators had planned. But humans were meant to grow. They were meant to face difficulties and learn from them, to experience heartbreak and discover resilience, to encounter injustice and choose to fight for something better. With steady hands now, Pandora opened the box. What emerged wasn't a storm of chaos, but something much more subtle, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. The whispers became gentle breezes that carried seeds of possibility out into the world. Some would grow into challenges, yes, but others would bloom into innovations, art, philosophy, and deeper kinds of love than the gods had ever imagined. Epimetheus found her there an hour later, sitting peacefully at the table with the empty box in front of her. "Did you?" he began, but she smiled and nodded. "I did what I was made to do," she said simply. And as they sat together, watching the sun climb higher over their valley, they both noticed something new in the morning light. It seemed brighter, somehow full of possibilities they'd never considered before. Later that day, they heard news from the village that made them smile. A young potter had discovered a new technique for making stronger clay vessels. A shepherd had figured out how to help his flock find better pastures. Two families who had been feuding for years had suddenly decided to work together on a project that would benefit everyone. The box had been full of potential, and now that potential was loose in the world, finding its way to anyone ready to embrace both the challenges and the opportunities that come with truly living. But here's the part of the story that gets lost in all the retellings. Pandora never regretted opening that box. Not even when she grew old and watched the world become more complicated, because she also watched humans solve problems, create beauty, love more deeply, and dream of futures their ancestors never could have imagined. And late at night, when she was very old and the box sat empty on her table like an old friend, she could still hear Hope's voice whispering in the wind that rustled through her olive trees, reminding her that no matter how dark things might seem somewhere in the world, someone was always ready to light a candle and keep going. As you settle deeper into your blankets tonight, maybe you can hear that same whisper, hope, still moving through the world, still finding its way to anyone who needs it most. That whisper of hope that followed Pandora through her long life found its way generations later to a simple farmer named Alexios, who lived in the rocky hills below Delphi, where the most famous oracle in ancient Greece spoke prophecies for kings and common people alike. But Alexios never went to the oracle with questions. Instead, he did something far more unusual. He made sure she had something to eat. Every morning, just as the first light touched the peaks of Mount Parnassus, Alexios would load his small wooden cart with fresh bread, goat cheese, olives from his 3 ancient trees, and whatever vegetables his rocky plot of land had managed to produce. The climb up to the temple of Apollo was steep and winding, but he'd been making this journey for 17 years, ever since he'd first seen the Pythia, the woman who served as Apollo's voice, looking thin and pale after a particularly intense day of prophecy. Most people think of the oracle at Delphi as some mysterious, otherworldly figure speaking in riddles while perched above sacred vapors. But Alexios knew something that the pilgrims and kings didn't. The Pythia was just a woman named Clio who got terrible headaches after channeling the gods' messages and often forgot to eat for days at a time. The first time he brought her food, she'd looked at him with surprise and something that might have been relief. Why? She'd asked, her voice still hoarse from a morning of prophecy. Because even oracles need breakfast, he'd replied simply, setting down a basket of warm bread and fresh cheese. That had been the beginning of their strange friendship, if you could call it a friendship. When one person speaks mainly in divine prophecies and the other mostly talks about crop rotation and whether the goats are getting into the neighbors' gardens again. This particular morning, as Alexios guided his cart up the familiar path, he was thinking about something Clio had said the day before. A wealthy merchant from Corinth had come seeking guidance about whether to invest in a new trade route. And after breathing the sacred vapors and falling into her prophetic trance, she'd announced, "The path that seems most golden will turn to dust, but the road built of small stones will carry you safely home." The merchant had frowned and asked for clarification. But Clio had already returned to her normal self and was rubbing her temples in that way that meant another headache was coming on. So Alexios had quietly left his usual offering bread, cheese, a handful of early figs and walked home, wondering what Apollo had really meant. Now, making his morning delivery, he found Clio sitting outside the temple in the early sunshine, looking unusually thoughtful. "Good morning," he said, unpacking his basket. "You look like someone who's been wrestling with the gods all night." She smiled, accepting the bread he offered. "Not the gods," she said softly, "just trying to understand what they want people to hear." This was unusual. Typically, Clio didn't remember much about what she said during her prophetic trances. The messages came through her, not from her, and afterward, she was left feeling empty and confused, like someone who'd been speaking a language she didn't actually know. "Some of yesterday's prophecy?" Alexios asked, settling beside her on the temple steps. Clio nodded slowly, breaking off a piece of bread and eating it with the careful attention of someone who'd forgotten meals too many times. The merchant was asking about profits and trade routes, but what came out was something about building something lasting instead of chasing something that glitters. Alexios considered this while watching the sun climb higher over the valley below. From where they sat, he could see his own small farm, just a few terrace plots carved into the hillside, his modest house with its red tile roof, the stone walls he'd built by hand to keep his goats from wandering. "Maybe," he said finally, "the god was telling him that real wealth comes from doing something useful every day instead of looking for one big score." Clio looked at him with interest. "You think that's what Apollo meant?" "I think Apollo speaks through you to tell people what they need to hear, not always what they want to hear. And maybe what that merchant needed to hear is that getting rich quick usually means someone else gets poor quick." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, eating bread and watching the world wake up below them. A shepherd was leading his flock to pasture, taking the same path his father and grandfather had taken. Smoke was rising from cooking fires in the village, where people were starting their daily routines, baking bread, feeding animals, greeting neighbors, beginning another day of the small, important work that keeps communities alive. After a while, Clio said, "You know, I've been thinking about something. You've been bringing me food for 17 years, every single morning, no matter the weather. You've never asked me for a prophecy. Never wanted to know your future or get advice about your problems. Never seemed necessary," Alexios replied. "I can see my future pretty clearly. Same as my past. Mostly, I'll plant seeds, tend them, fix things that break, help neighbors when they need it, maybe find a wife someday. Maybe not. Either way, there'll be work to do and people to feed. But don't you want to know if your crops will fail, or if you'll find love, or how long you'll live?" Alexios considered this seriously. "If I knew my crops would fail, I'd worry about it every day until they did. If I knew they'd succeed, I might get lazy and not tend them properly. If I knew when I'd die, I'd spend all my time before then being anxious about it instead of just living." He paused, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "But I do know one thing for certain." "What's that?" "Tomorrow morning, you'll be hungry again, and I'll be here with breakfast." Cleo laughed, a sound of pure delight that echoed off the temple walls. That might be the most accurate prophecy anyone's made at Delphi in years. As if summoned by their laughter, a young woman appeared on the path below, climbing toward the temple with the determined stride of someone carrying a heavy burden. Even from a distance, they could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept pausing to look back, as if she were being followed by troubles that couldn't be outrun. "Another seeker," Cleo murmured, automatically shifting into her professional demeanor. But Alexios was watching the woman more carefully. "Look at her sandals," he said, "worn through at the heels. And that cloak, good quality once, but mended in several places. She'd been traveling for a long time, and she'd spent most of her money getting here." When the woman finally reached the temple, she was breathing hard and trying not to show how exhausted she was. She approached Cleo with the formal gestures of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in her mind many times. "Oracle of Apollo," she began, "I seek guidance." But Alexios stood up and offered her his place on the steps. "Sit first," he said gently. "Rest a moment. Have some bread and water." The woman looked surprised but gratefully accepted both the seat and the food. As she ate, her story came out in pieces. Her name was Thalia. Her husband had died in a farming accident, leaving her with 3 young children and debts she couldn't pay. She'd sold almost everything she owned and walked for 12 days to reach Delphi, hoping for divine guidance about whether to remarry a man who could provide for her family, but whom she didn't love, or to try to make it on her own despite the odds against her. When she finished speaking, Cleo prepared to enter the temple and consult the sacred vapors. But before she could rise, Alexios spoke up. "Before you ask the god," he said to Thalia, "maybe I could ask you something. What did you do before your husband died? What were you good at?" Thalia looked puzzled. I kept house, raised children, helped with the harvest. I make good bread, and I know herbs, healing ones, seasoning ones. People used to ask me for remedies when their children were sick, and you walked 12 days to get here. Yes, Star. You're strong, determined. And you know how to plan for a long journey. You understand herbs and healing. You can bake, and you've successfully raised 3 children while helping run a farm." Alexios looked at her seriously. "Thalia, you don't need a prophecy. You need a place where those skills are valued." He turned to Cleo. "How many pilgrims come here every day? 20, 30 more during festival seasons. And they all need food, lodging, someone to tend their travel-worn feet and ease their anxious minds before they consult the oracle." Understanding dawned in Cleo's eyes. "Thalia, what if your answer isn't about choosing between 2 difficult paths, but about creating a third one? What if you stayed here in Delphi and set up an inn for pilgrims? You could use all your skills, support your children, and build something that's entirely your own." Thalia stared at them both. "I never thought, but I don't have money to start an inn." "You have skills," Alexios said. "And this community needs what you can offer. Start small, maybe just offering bread and herb teas to travelers. Let people know that you're here, that you're reliable, that you care about their comfort. Build it stone by stone, day by day." Later, after Thalia had left to explore the village and consider this new possibility, Cleo turned to Alexios with wonder in her eyes. "That was better than any prophecy I could have given her." "Maybe," Alexios said. "The best prophecy is just helping people see what they already know but were afraid to believe." As the sun reached its peak and the day grew warm, Alexios prepared to head back down the mountain to his own work. But before he left, Cleo caught his arm. "Alexios, in 17 years, you've never asked me for anything, but I want to give you something anyway." She closed her eyes for a moment, not falling into a prophetic trance, but simply listening to something deeper than the sacred vapors. Your crops will sometimes fail and sometimes flourish, as crops do. You may find love, or you may not, as life decides. You'll live as long as you live, and it will be enough. But here's what I know for certain. Every morning that you choose to climb this hill with food for a hungry person, you make the world a little more like what the gods intended it to be. And that's a kind of immortality that no prophecy could improve upon. Walking back down the mountain path, his empty cart bumping over familiar stones, Alexios smiled. Tomorrow morning he would get up early, load his cart with fresh bread and whatever his garden had produced, and make the climb to Delphi again, not because a prophecy told him to, but because some kinds of certainty don't need divine revelation. They just need daily choice. And perhaps that's the most boring and beautiful truth of all, that the future is built not by grand gestures or mystical revelations, but by the simple decision to show up tomorrow and do something useful for another person. That simple wisdom about showing up each day, which guided Alexios up the mountain path to Delphi, had found its way into the very foundations of Athens through an unlikely source, a 10-year-old girl named Meera, who collected salt from tears. Not real tears, of course, though the story begins with plenty of those. Meera lived during the early days of Athens, when the city was still figuring out how to be more than just another collection of houses clustered around a hill. Her father, Nicias, was a stonemason who worked on the great building projects that would someday make Athens famous. But in those days, he mostly repaired walls and laid foundations for modest houses. The salt came from the sea naturally, but getting it to the city was more complicated than you might expect. Meera's job, a job she'd invented herself, was to walk down to the harbor every morning, where the salt merchants unloaded their wares, and collect the salt crystals that spilled from broken bags or fell through cracks in the wooden crates. It was humble work, the kind that adults tend to overlook, but Meera had noticed something interesting about salt. A small amount could preserve food for months. A pinch could make even stale bread taste better. And when mixed with certain herbs her grandmother knew, it could clean wounds and prevent infection. More importantly, she'd noticed that buildings lasted longer in places where salt spray from the ocean settled into the mortar between stones. This observation might have remained just a curious fact in a young girl's mind, except for what happened during the Great Wall project of her 11th year. Athens was growing, and with growth came the need for better defenses, not just against armies, though those were a concern, but against the floods that came every few years when winter rains swelled the rivers, and against the earth tremors that occasionally shook buildings apart. The city council had commissioned a new section of defensive wall, and Nicias was chosen as one of the master masons for the project. He was proud of this appointment, but also worried. The materials they'd been given were good, but not exceptional. The stones were local limestone, soft enough to work with, but prone to cracking. The mortar was the standard mixture of lime, sand, and water. It would make a functional wall, but probably not one that would last centuries. Meera had been watching the work progress, and she'd been thinking about those salt-strengthened stones down at the harbor. One evening, as her father sat on their doorstep cleaning mortar from his hands and complaining that the day's work had already started to show small cracks, she made a suggestion. What if we mixed salt into the mortar? Nicias looked at his daughter with the patient expression adults use when children suggest impossible things. Salt costs money, little mouse, and even if we could afford it, who knows if it would help or hurt? But Meera had been saving her collected salt for months now, storing it in clay jars in their small storage room. She had enough to make a test batch of mortar, and she had an idea for how to prove whether it would work. Behind their house was a low retaining wall that held back a small garden terrace. Nothing important, nothing that would matter if it failed. With her father's permission, she mixed a batch of salt mortar and rebuilt a section of that wall. Then she waited. The first test came with the autumn rains. The regular mortar in other parts of the wall softened and cracked where water collected, but Meera's salt mortar section remained solid. The second test came with a winter freeze, when ice formed in the tiny gaps between stones. Again, the salt section held firm while traditional mortar cracked and crumbled. By spring, Even the most skeptical masons in the city were talking about the girl who'd figured out how to make mortar that lasted through whether that destroyed everything else. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Meera didn't try to profit from her discovery. Instead, she made a proposal to the city council that was so unusual they almost didn't know how to respond. She would organize the children of Athens to collect salt from the harbor, the same way she'd been doing for years, not just her, but dozens of children who could make a little money while contributing to something important. The city would buy this salt at fair prices, not enough to make anyone rich, but enough to make the children feel valued for their work. And instead of keeping the salt mortar technique secret, she would teach it to any mason who wanted to learn. The council was puzzled. But why give away something so valuable? Asked Counselor Demetrios. You could charge premium prices for salt-strengthened construction. Meera, now 12 and growing into the kind of thoughtful young woman who chooses her words carefully, stood before the assembled adults and explained her reasoning. If only the rich can afford buildings that last, then only the rich get to build things that matter. But if everyone knows how to make stronger mortar, then everything we build, walls, houses, workshops, temples, everything becomes more permanent. The whole city becomes stronger. She paused, looking around the room at the men who made decisions for Athens. Besides, I've been thinking about time. My father says that a good wall should last for his grandchildren to see. But what if we could build walls that lasted for our grandchildren's grandchildren? What if every person who built something in Athens knew they were contributing to something that would still be here centuries from now? The idea took hold slowly, the way good ideas often do. First, a few masons began experimenting with salt mortar on their own projects. Then, word spread to other cities, where builders began arriving in Athens to learn the technique. Within a few years, Athenian mortar had become synonymous with construction that was built to last. But the real change wasn't just in the strength of the buildings, it was in how people thought about their work. When you know that what you're building might stand for centuries, you pay attention to details you might otherwise skip. You choose your materials more carefully. You take time to get measurements exactly right. You think about how weather and time will affect your work. More than that, you start to think about the people who will use what you've built long after you're gone. Meera, now grown and married to a potter named Lysander, would often walk through the city and point out buildings that used her salt mortar technique. But she took special pride in the smaller structures, the neighborhood walls that kept children's play areas safe, the market stalls that provided shelter for elderly vendors, the public fountains that gave everyone access to clean water. See, she would tell her own children, when you make good things available to everyone, the whole world becomes more beautiful. The salt walls of Athens became famous throughout Greece, not just for their strength, but for what they represented. Here was a city where a child's observation had been taken seriously, where innovation was shared rather than hoarded, where every building project was approached as a gift to future generations. Visitors would often ask to see the great salt walls, expecting some magnificent fortress or temple. But the Athenians would smile and gesture around them at the sturdy houses, the reliable market buildings, the neighborhood walls that had weathered decades of storms and earthquakes. All of them, they would say, every wall in Athens is a salt wall now. And late at night, when the city settled into sleep, you could almost hear the buildings themselves whispering their gratitude to the little girl who had paid attention to spilt salt, to the masons who had been willing to learn from a child, to a community that had chosen permanence over profit. The walls of Athens still stand in many places, their salt-strengthened mortar as solid today as it was centuries ago. And perhaps that's the most beautiful part of this quiet story, that somewhere right now, in the moonlight, those ancient stones continue to do their job, protecting and sheltering. Built by people who understood that the most important work is the kind that lasts long after we're gone. That understanding of lasting work, which Meera had woven into the very walls of Athens, found its way decades later to the most ambitious building project the city had ever attempted, the temple that would become known as the Parthenon, rising majestically on the Acropolis above the city. But our story isn't about the famous architects or the skilled sculptors who made the Parthenon beautiful. It's about a 9-year-old boy named Damon, whose job was to climb into spaces too small for adult workers, and who noticed something that nearly everyone else had missed. Damon was what they called a gap boy, one of several children employed on the construction site to crawl through the narrow spaces between scaffolding, retrieve drop tools, and inspect areas where grown men couldn't fit. It was considered safe work mostly, and it paid enough to help his widowed mother buy food and keep their small apartment near the agora. He loved the work, especially the climbing. Every morning, he would scramble up the wooden scaffolding that surrounded the growing temple like a forest of pine poles and rope, and spend his day moving through the maze of construction like a small, careful spider. From up there he could see all of Athens spread below him, the red tile roofs of houses, the green spaces where people kept gardens, the harbor in the distance, where ships arrived daily with marble from the islands and wood from the northern forests. But more than the view, he loved the feeling of being part of something grand and permanent. Every block of marble that went into place, every column that rose toward the sky, every carved detail that emerged under the sculptor's chisels, all of it was becoming part of something that would outlast everyone who worked on it. Damon had been working on the site for almost a year when he noticed the problem with the roof. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd only spot if you spent your days crawling through the upper reaches of the scaffolding. The marble beams that would support the roof were magnificent, perfectly cut, beautifully fitted, strong enough to hold up the heavy tiles and decorative elements that would complete the temple. But they had one small flaw that was going to become a big problem. Each beam had been carved with a slight upward curve designed to counteract the tendency of heavy stone to sag over time. This was good engineering, the kind of detail that separated master builders from ordinary ones. But in the narrow channels where rainwater would flow off the roof, that upward curve created tiny low spots where water would collect instead of draining away. Most of the year this wouldn't matter. Athens was dry, and most rain fell in brief, heavy showers that would wash quickly off any roof. But Damon had lived through several of the winter seasons when steady, soaking rains could last for days, and he knew what happened to marble when water sat in small depressions for long periods. It cracks slowly, invisibly at first, but inevitably. The problem was that no one else seemed to have noticed this, and Damon was just a 9-year-old gap boy. The master architect, Ictinus, was famous throughout Greece for his precision and skill. The project foreman, Callicrates, had supervised the construction of dozens of important buildings. The marble carvers were artists whose work would be admired for centuries. Who was he to suggest that they'd made a mistake? For several days, Damon worried about this alone. He would climb up to inspect the roof structure during his lunch breaks, running his small fingers along the channels where water would flow, measuring the tiny depressions with pieces of string, trying to convince himself that he was wrong. But the more he looked, the more certain he became that these small imperfections would eventually destroy the temple from above the way termites destroy a house from within. Finally, he decided to approach Phidias, the master sculptor who oversaw all the artistic elements of the building. Phidias was known for being patient with young workers, and he had a reputation for listening to ideas that came from unexpected sources. Damon found the great artist taking a break in the shade of the scaffolding, sketching designs for one of the pediment sculptures that would crown the completed temple. It took all of Damon's courage to interrupt. "Master Phidias," he began, his voice smaller than he'd intended. "Could I show you something that's been worrying me?" Phidias looked up from his sketching with the kind expression of someone who genuinely enjoyed teaching. "Of course, young Damon. What's troubling you?" Instead of trying to explain in words, Damon led the sculptor up through the scaffolding to the roof level, where the marble support beams stretched across the width of the temple like the ribs of some enormous creature. "Look here," Damon said, pointing to one of the drainage channels. "When it rains, the water will flow down from the high point of the roof. But when it gets to these low spots, it won't keep moving. It'll just sit there." Phidias knelt beside the boy and ran his own experienced fingers along the marble surface. After a moment, he pulled out a small bronze tool and let a few drops of water from his drinking cup flow down the channel. The water moved smoothly at first, then pooled in exactly the spots Damon had predicted. "How long have you been noticing this?" Phidias asked, his voice serious now. A few weeks. I kept hoping I was wrong, but every time I check, the water pools in the same places. Phidias was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the city below them, then back at the roof structure that represented months of careful planning and expensive work. Damon, he said finally, I need you to show this to Master Ictinus right now. What followed was one of the most tense conversations in the history of the Parthenon's construction. Ictinus, confronted with evidence that his roof design had a potentially catastrophic flaw, went through every emotion from disbelief to anger to something that looked like panic before settling into the focused determination of a master craftsman who needed to solve a problem. The solution, when they found it, was elegant and expensive. Each affected marble beam would need to be removed, taken back to the carvers' workshops, and recut with slightly deeper drainage channels that would carry water past the low spots. It would add months to the construction schedule and require several skilled craftsmen to redo work they thought they'd completed perfectly. But the alternative, a temple that would slowly destroy itself from rainwater damage, was unthinkable. As the rework began, Damon found himself something of a celebrity on the construction site. Workers who had barely noticed him before now sought his opinion on their own small concerns and observations. But more importantly, the experience changed how everyone thought about the building process. Ictinus instituted a new practice. Every week, workers at all levels from master craftsmen to gap boys would gather to discuss anything they'd noticed that seemed unusual or potentially problematic. No observation was too small to mention. No worker too junior to speak up. They discovered dozens of small improvements this way. A stone carver noticed that morning sunlight revealed chisel marks invisible in afternoon light, leading to a change in the sculptor's working schedules. A scaffolding assembler suggested a different knot that made the support ropes less likely to stretch in wet weather. An elderly marble polisher shared a technique for detecting hairline cracks that weren't visible to younger eyes. Each improvement was small by itself, but together they transformed the Parthenon from a merely beautiful building into something approaching perfection. Years later, when the temple was complete and had survived its first decade of Athenian weather, Damon, now a young man learning the stone carver's trade, would often climb back up to the roof level to check the drainage channels he'd worried about as a child. The water flowed smoothly now, carrying away each season's rains without leaving a trace. The marble beams remained strong and unblemished, supporting their burden of tiles and decorative elements with the patient strength that good architecture provides. But the most beautiful thing about those roof visits wasn't the technical success of the repair. It was the knowledge that hundreds of other workers had also felt empowered to notice, to contribute their own observations to the creation of something magnificent. The Parthenon became famous for its proportions, its sculptures, its architectural innovations. But among the builders themselves, it was also remembered as the first great project where wisdom was understood to come from anyone who paid close attention regardless of age or status. And late at night, when moonlight illuminated the temple's columns and cast long shadows across the Acropolis, you could almost hear the building itself breathing, taking in the cool night air and releasing the warmth of day. Its perfect drainage carrying away the dew that formed on marble surfaces, every part working in harmony because a 9-year-old boy had cared enough to speak up about what he'd noticed. The Parthenon still stands today, its roof still shedding rain as efficiently as it did 25 centuries ago, a testament to the truth that the most important insights sometimes come from the smallest voices, if we're wise enough to listen. That wisdom about listening to small voices which had saved the Parthenon's roof and changed how Athens approached great projects found its way into an unexpected place. A quiet festival that almost no one remembers, dedicated to the olive trees that grew on the slopes around the city. The festival was called the Elephoria, which simply means olive-bearing, and it happened once a year on the day when the olive harvest officially began. Unlike the Grand Panathenæa, with its processions and sacrifices, or the dramatic Dionysia, with its plays and competitions, the Elephoria was small, local, and focused on something most people took for granted: the trees that provided oil for lamps, food, medicine, and trade. But in the year our story takes place, something unusual happened that turned this quiet festival into one of the most moving experiences in Athenian memory. It began with an old woman named Philomene, who tended a grove of ancient olive trees on the hillside above the city. These weren't just any olive trees, they were said to be descended from the very first olive tree that Athena had caused to spring from the Acropolis rock when she competed with Poseidon for patronage of the city. Whether that was literally true didn't matter much to Philomene. What mattered was that these trees were old, some of them several hundred years old, and that they produced the finest oil in Attica. Their gnarled trunks and silver-green leaves had watched Athens grow from a small settlement into the greatest city in Greece. But this particular autumn, Philomene noticed something troubling. The trees were producing plenty of olives, but the fruit seemed different, somehow smaller than usual, with a bitter undertone that hadn't been there in previous years. At first, she thought it might be the weather. The summer had been drier than normal, and perhaps the trees were stressed from lack of rainfall. But as the harvest time approached, she began to suspect something else was happening. The trees, she realized, were sad. Now, this might sound like the fancy of an old woman who'd spent too much time alone with her trees, but Philomene had been tending olives for 60 years. She knew these particular trees better than she knew most people, and she'd learned to read their moods the way others read the expressions on human faces. When the trees were happy after good rains, or when the soil was rich, or during the peaceful years when Athens wasn't at war, their olives were plump and sweet, their oil golden and fragrant. When they were stressed or neglected, the fruit became small and bitter. But this year felt different. This year, the trees seemed to be grieving. As the Euphoria approached, Philomene found herself wondering what could make ancient olive trees mourn. She spent her evenings sitting among the gnarled trunks, listening to the wind rustle through the silver leaves, trying to understand what they might be trying to tell her. The answer came to her gradually, like dawnlight revealing a landscape that had been hidden in darkness. The trees were old enough to remember. They had lived through generations of human history, watching families grow up and grow old, witnessing the slow changes that shape a city over centuries. And what they were mourning, Philomene realized, was not something that had happened recently, but something that was slowly disappearing. The connection between the people of Athens and the land that sustained them was weakening. More and more Athenians bought their olive oil from merchants in the agora, rather than tending their own trees. Families that had maintained small groves for generations were selling their land to developers who wanted to build houses closer to the city. Young people were choosing careers in trade, politics, or philosophy, instead of learning the patient arts of farming and tree tending. It wasn't anyone's fault exactly. Athens was becoming cosmopolitan, sophisticated, connected to the wider world. These were good things in many ways. But something precious was being lost in the process: the intimate knowledge of seasons and soil, of how to read the health of a tree and the color of its leaves, of the deep satisfaction that comes from tending something that will outlive you by centuries. The morning of the Euphoria, Philomene made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of conducting the traditional ceremony alone in her grove, she loaded a cart with branches from her oldest tree's branches, heavy with the small, sad olives, and brought them down to the city. She set up her cart in the agora, not to sell anything, but simply to let people see and touch the olive branches from trees that had been growing when their great-grandparents were children. These trees remember, she told anyone who would listen. They remember when your family first came to Athens. They remember the taste of soil from when it was richer, and the sound of more birds singing in the mornings, and the way people used to visit them regularly to check on their health. At first, people were polite but distracted. The agora was busy, and most shoppers had specific errands to accomplish. But gradually something interesting began to happen. An elderly potter named Theron stopped to examine the olive branches and began telling stories about the trees his grandfather had planted behind their house. A young mother with twin boys discovered that the children were fascinated by different shapes of olive leaves and found herself explaining how olive oil was made. A merchant who traded in luxury goods from Egypt and Persia paused to smell the distinctive scent of fresh olive wood and suddenly remembered helping his father harvest olives as a child, the weight of the bags. The satisfying sound of ripe fruit dropping from branches, the way the whole family would work together during harvest time. By midday, a small crowd had gathered around Philomene's cart. But they weren't just listening to her stories, they were sharing their own memories. Asking questions about tree care, wondering aloud about groves and gardens they'd left behind, or never learned to tend. That's when Philomene made her proposal. "What if," she said, "instead of just remembering the connection between Athens and its trees, we renewed it? What if this Eliphoria became not just a festival to mark the harvest, but a day when everyone in the city took time to visit the olive groves, to touch the earth, to remember that our civilization grows from the same soil as our trees?" The idea caught fire in the way that good ideas sometimes do. Within hours, small groups were forming to walk out to the olive groves on the hills around Athens. Families who hadn't visited their ancestral trees in years suddenly decided to make the journey. Young people who'd never seen an olive harvest found themselves curious about the process. Even city officials joined the informal pilgrimage, including the archon, who normally spent festival days in ceremonial duties at temples. What they found in the groves was something none of them had expected. The trees, surrounded by more human visitors than they'd seen in decades, seemed to respond to the attention. The olives that had seemed small and bitter in the morning light appeared fuller, more flavorful when tasted by people who approached them with genuine interest and gratitude. But more than that, the people discovered something they'd been missing without realizing it, the deep peace that comes from connecting with something larger and more permanent than daily human concerns. Standing beneath branches that had been growing for centuries, breathing air filtered through leaves that had witnessed the rise of democracy. Touching bark that had weathered more storms than any human would ever see it, put the anxieties and ambitions of city life into a different perspective. As the day wore on, the informal gathering began to take on the character of a true festival. Someone brought a flute, and others began singing traditional harvest songs. Families shared food they'd brought for the journey, and elderly tree tenders like Philomene found themselves surrounded by young people eager to learn forgotten techniques for reading tree health and predicting harvest quality. But the most moving moment came near sunset, when a child, a girl of perhaps 7, pointed to one of the oldest trees and asked a question that silenced the entire crowd. "Why are the trees crying?" Everyone looked where she was pointing, and there, glistening on the bark of several ancient olive trees, were droplets of what looked like tears, clear, sweet-smelling moisture that seemed to be weeping from the wood itself. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Philomene smiled and knelt beside the little girl. "They're not sad tears," she said softly. "They're happy tears. The trees are crying with joy because their people have come home to visit them." Whether this was scientifically accurate didn't matter. What mattered was that everyone present understood, in that moment, that they had rekindled something important, not just their connection to the trees that sustained their city, but their understanding of themselves as participants in something larger than individual human lives. The Eliphoria became an annual tradition after that, but not the formal kind of festival with official ceremonies and prescribed rituals. Instead, it remained what it had become that first day. A time when the people of Athens remembered to visit their trees, to touch the earth, to spend a day outside the city walls in the company of growing things. And every year on that day, the olive trees throughout Attica seemed to weep their happy tears, reminding anyone who cared to notice that some of the most important relationships in life are with beings that never speak, but have been listening all along. That understanding of quiet relationships, which the olive trees had taught the people of Athens, found its way across the wine-dark sea to a small island called Scheria, where an elderly shipbuilder named Nausicaa worked in a cove so peaceful that even the waves seemed to whisper rather than crash. You might recognize that name, Nausicaa, from Homer's stories about Odysseus. But this isn't the young princess who found the hero washed up on her beach. This is her great-aunt, a woman who had spent 60 years learning everything there was to know about how wooden ships survive the moods of the sea. Nausicaa, the shipbuilder, lived in a workshop that smelled of pine resin and salt air, where curved ribs of olive wood waited to become the bones of vessels that would carry people safely across waters that could change from gentle to deadly in the space of a heartbeat. She was known throughout the islands for building ships that came home. Not the fastest ships, or the most beautiful, or the ones that could carry the heaviest cargo, but the ones that kept sailing season after season, bringing their crews back to families who waited on docks and beaches, watching the horizon for familiar sails. The secret to her success wasn't dramatic or mysterious. It was simply that she paid attention to details that other shipbuilders considered unimportant, and she never forgot that the sea was stronger than any human creation. Every piece of wood that went into her ships was chosen not just for strength, but for how it would behave when wet, when dry, when hot, when cold, when flexed by waves that came from different directions. She knew that olive wood bent without breaking, that pine was light but needed careful treatment to resist rot, that oak was strong but heavy and could make a ship sluggish in light winds. More than that, she understood that a ship was not just a collection of wooden parts held together with rope and bronze fittings. It was a living thing that had to work in harmony with forces beyond human control. The morning Odysseus arrived on her beach, Nausicaa was working on what she thought might be her final ship. Her hands, skilled as they were, had begun to shake slightly when she held small tools, and her eyes sometimes struggled to see the grain patterns in wood that guided her decisions about how to cut and shape each piece. She looked up from her work to see a man walking slowly along the shoreline, examining the various boats pulled up on the sand with the careful attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. He was middle-aged, with graying hair and skin weathered by sun and salt. His clothes were well-made, but showed the kind of wear that comes from long traveling, rather than simple poverty. When he reached her workshop, he paused to watch her work without speaking, which told her immediately that he was either a craftsman himself or someone who had learned to respect the concentration that careful work requires. After several minutes, she set down her tools and looked at him directly. "You're not from Syria," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he replied. "I'm trying to get home to Ithaca. I've been traveling for longer than I expected." There was something in his voice, weariness, but also a kind of careful diplomacy that suggested this was a significant understatement. Nausicaa had built ships for traders, fishermen, and refugees over the years, and she'd learned to recognize the different kinds of stories that brought people to her workshop. This man had the look of someone who'd seen more of the world than he'd ever wanted to. "Ithaca's not far," she said, "but the waters between here and there can be tricky. Sailing, what kind of vessel were you planning to take?" Odysseus, though he hadn't yet introduced himself by name, gestured toward the harbor, where several trading ships were anchored, waiting for favorable winds. "I was hoping to book passage on one of those, but the captains keep delaying departure, and I'm beginning to think I'd be better off with something smaller and more reliable." Nausicaa studied his face, reading the frustration and determination there. "Something you could sail yourself, if necessary. I've handled boats before." This was another significant understatement, though Nausicaa didn't know it yet. What she did know was that this traveler had the patient, watchful demeanor of someone who'd learned not to trust his fate entirely to other people's decisions. "I might have something that would work," she said, leading him around to the other side of her workshop, where a small, elegant sailing boat sat on wooden supports. "I built her for my nephew, but he decided to become a philosopher instead of a fisherman. She's been waiting for the right sailor." The boat was beautiful in the way that purely functional things can be, every line clean and purposeful, every joint fitted with the precision that comes from decades of experience. But what impressed Odysseus most was that she looked like she was built to handle trouble. The hull was deeper than typical for a boat her size, which would make her more stable in rough water. The sail rigging was simple but robust, designed to be managed by one person even in challenging conditions. Most importantly, he could see extra storage spaces built into the hull, places for food, water, and emergency supplies that might mean the difference between life and death on a longer voyage than planned. "She's made for someone who understands that the sea doesn't care about your schedule," Nausicaa explained, running her hand along the smooth gunwale. "Fast enough when the wind's with you, steady enough when it's not, and strong enough to keep going when other boats would turn back." Over the next several days, while Odysseus waited for the right weather conditions to begin his journey home, he found himself spending more and more time in Nausicaa's workshop, ostensibly to learn about the boat's particular characteristics, but increasingly because he was fascinated by her approach to craftsmanship. He had traveled extensively, seen the work of shipbuilders throughout the Mediterranean, commanded vessels built by the finest craftsmen in the Greek world, but he had never met anyone who thought about boats the way Nausicaa did. Not as objects to be built and used, but as partners in the difficult art of surviving at sea. "The sea is not your enemy," she explained one afternoon as they sat in the shade of her workshop, sharing bread and olives while the boat dried after a fresh coat of protective oil. "But it's not your friend either. It's something much more complicated, like a powerful neighbor who doesn't speak your language, but whose moods you need to understand if you want to live peacefully nearby." She pointed out toward the harbor, where the water shifted colors from blue to green to gray as clouds moved across the sun. Every day the sea is different. Different winds, different currents, different temperatures. The same waters that carry you safely home one day might sink you the next if you approach them with the wrong attitude. "What's the right attitude?" Odysseus asked, genuinely curious. "Respect without fear. Confidence without arrogance. And always have a backup plan." As they talked, Nausicaa began to modify the boat based on what she learned about Odysseus's particular situation. She added extra cleats for securing cargo, installed a more sophisticated steering system that would be easier to manage single-handed, and, most importantly, she taught him how to read the subtle signs that would tell him when the weather was changing before the change became dangerous. "See how the water looks different near those rocks?" she pointed out during one of their practice sails around the harbor. "That means the current is shifting. And notice how the birds are flying closer to shore than they were this morning. That usually means wind from a different direction is coming." But the most valuable thing she taught him wasn't technical knowledge, it was patience. "I can see you're eager to get home," she said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the water gold and red. "You've been away a long time, and someone's waiting for you." Odysseus nodded, thinking of Penelope and Telemachus, of the life he'd left behind what felt like a lifetime ago. "But eagerness can be dangerous at sea," Nausicaa continued. "It makes you push when you should wait. Take risks when you should be cautious. The sea rewards patience and punishes haste more consistently than any other force I know." She was quiet for a moment, watching the water darken as night approached. "The boat will get you home, but only if you let it do its job instead of forcing it to do yours." The morning Odysseus finally departed. The weather was perfect, steady winds from the right direction, clear skies, calm seas. But as he prepared to leave, Nausicaa had one final gift for him. It was a small wooden box, carefully sealed with wax and fitted with leather straps so it could be secured inside the boat's hull. "Emergency supplies," she explained. "Food that won't spoil, water that will stay fresh, basic tools for repairs, but also something else." "What?" "Instructions for building a signal fire, written in several different languages and dialects, if you end up somewhere unexpected. This will help you communicate your situation to anyone who might be able to help." Odysseus accepted the box with the same serious attention he'd given to everything else she'd taught him. "Why are you doing all this for a stranger?" he asked. Nausicaa smiled, looking out at the boat that bobbed gently in the shallow water, ready for the journey ahead. "Because every sailor who makes it home safely makes the sea a little more friendly for the next person who needs to cross it. Your safe journey becomes part of the knowledge that keeps other sailors alive." As Odysseus sailed away from Scheria that morning, he carried with him more than just a well-built boat and practical supplies. He carried the understanding that craftsmanship, at its highest level, is always about serving something larger than immediate need, about contributing to the accumulated wisdom that helps communities survive and thrive. The boat Nausicaa built did indeed carry him home to Ithaca, where Penelope waited, and where his story could finally reach its proper conclusion. But perhaps more importantly, the lessons she taught him about patience, respect, and preparation became part of how he lived the rest of his life. And years later, when young sailors from Ithaca came to him for advice about long voyages, he would share what the elderly shipbuilder had taught him. that the most important skill for any journey is not knowing how to go fast, but knowing how to keep going when the going gets difficult. That wisdom about keeping going when things get difficult, which Nausicaa had shared with Odysseus in their peaceful cove, found its way to a much less peaceful place. A dusty border region between two city-states that had been fighting each other for so long that most people had forgotten what they were fighting about. The war between megalopolis and Cly had started over water rights, or trade routes, or maybe an insult offered at a diplomatic dinner 30 years ago. The details had become blurred through decades of raids, counter-raids, burned crops, and interrupted lives. What remained clear was that both cities were exhausted. Both populations were tired of sending their young people off to fight. And yet, neither side could figure out how to stop pride, mostly, and the fear that stopping would be seen as losing. In a small farmhouse exactly halfway between the two cities lived an elderly widow named Karina, who had the misfortune of owning land that both armies considered strategically important. Her fields provided high ground useful for watching enemy movements, and her well was the only reliable source of fresh water for several miles in any direction. This meant that her farm changed hands regularly, sometimes controlled by megalopolis, sometimes by Cly, depending on whose soldiers had been more successful in the latest skirmish. Karina had learned to be diplomatically neutral, providing water and occasional meals to whoever happened to be occupying her land, while trying to keep her vegetable garden and her small flock of chickens safe from the disruptions of war. It was not an easy way to live, but Karina had developed a philosophy that helped her cope. She focused on small daily tasks that made sense regardless of what was happening in the larger world. Feed the chickens, tend the garden, repair whatever needed fixing, treat all visitors politely but carefully. The morning that changed everything began like many others, with Karina discovering that soldiers from both armies had used her property overnight. A patrol from Megalopolis had camped near her well, leaving behind the usual debris of a military meal, scattered olive pits, bread crusts, and a broken clay water jar that had apparently cracked when someone dropped it. About an hour later, a scouting party from Cly arrived to check whether the Megalopolis soldiers were still in the area. Finding only Karina sweeping the remains of their meal into a basket, the Cly captain relaxed and asked if his men could water their horses at her well. Of course, she agreed. She always agreed. Refusing water to armed soldiers was not a sustainable strategy for a lone elderly woman. But as the Cly soldiers were watering their horses, one of them noticed the broken pottery pieces in Karina's basket. "That's a nice water jar," he commented. "Shame it's broken." That looked like good craftsmanship. Karina paused in her sweeping. "It was beautiful," she admitted. "I was admiring it before it got dropped. The clay was so smooth, and the painting around the rim was delicate work. Someone put real care into making it." The soldier, whose name was Theron, knelt down and picked up a few of the larger pieces, fitting them together to see the original shape. "My sister makes pottery like this," he said quietly. "Same technique for the painting. Same style of handles. This might even be her work." He held up a piece that showed part of an intricate design, geometric patterns interwoven, with tiny flowers painted in the distinctive blue-black that potters in Cly were known for. "It is her work," he said with sudden certainty. "I helped her load these jars onto a trader's cart just 2 months ago. She was so proud of this batch, said they were the best she'd ever made." Karina looked at the broken pottery with new interest. "Your sister's work ended up with Megalopolis soldiers, apparently. Which means—" Theron paused, working through the implications. "Which means that despite this war, people from our cities are still trading with each other. Someone from Megalopolis liked these jars enough to buy them." It was a small revelation, but it started a conversation that continued after the other soldiers had finished watering their horses and were ready to move on. Theron lingered, still examining the pottery pieces, reluctant to leave behind this unexpected connection to his sister's work. "Could I?" he began hesitantly. "Could I take a piece back to show her? She'd be heartbroken to know one of her jars was broken, but she'd also be pleased to learn it had traveled so far and been used by someone who appreciated good craftsmanship." Karina not only agreed, but spent the next few minutes helping him select the piece that best showed his sister's distinctive painting style. As they worked together, she found herself telling him about other objects she'd noticed over the years: weapons, tools, clothing, decorative items that soldiers from both armies had carried, many of which showed clear signs of having been made in the enemy city. "It's as if the war is happening on top of a completely different reality," she mused. "One where people from both cities actually like and need what the other city produces." This conversation might have remained just an interesting moment between two people, except what happened when Theron returned to his unit with the pottery fragment and the story behind it. His sister Melina was indeed moved to learn that her work had reached Megalopolis and had been valued there. But more than that, she was intrigued by the idea that trade between the two cities was continuing despite the official state of war. She began asking questions of other craftspeople, traders, and even soldiers she knew. What she discovered was that a complex network of unofficial commerce had developed over the years, with goods from both cities reaching consumers in the other through intermediaries, circuitous routes, and informal arrangements that everyone pretended not to notice. Megalopolis produced excellent olive oil and wine, but their pottery was utilitarian at best. Cly made beautiful ceramics and metalwork, but their soil wasn't ideal for olives, and their wine was famously terrible. Despite 30 years of official hostility, people from both cities had found ways to obtain what they needed from each other. Melina decided to do something unprecedented. She loaded a cart with her finest pottery not to sell through intermediaries, but to take directly to Megalopolis and offer to the people who had been buying her work indirectly for years. It was a bold move that could have resulted in her arrest, exile, or worse. But when she arrived at the Megalopolis market square, something unexpected happened. People recognized her style immediately. Several customers approached her to say they owned pieces of her work and had been hoping to find more. A few mentioned specific jars or bowls they'd purchased from traveling merchants, describing them with a kind of detailed appreciation that only comes from daily use and genuine admiration. More importantly, they began talking to her about their own needs and preferences, giving her suggestions for designs that would be even more useful in their households, asking about custom pieces that would solve specific problems they faced. By the end of the day, Melina had not only sold everything she brought, but had taken orders for 12 custom pieces. More significantly, she'd established direct relationships with people who had previously been just anonymous customers reached through the shadowy network of wartime trade. Word of this successful visit spread quickly in both cities, and within weeks other craftspeople began making similar direct trading trips. A winemaker from Megalopolis visited Cly to find customers for his finest vintages. A metalworker from Cly brought specialized tools to Megalopolis artisans who had been seeking exactly those implements for years. Each successful trading visit demonstrated the same thing. Despite 30 years of official war, the people of both cities had more in common than in conflict. They needed similar things, appreciated similar quality, and faced similar problems in their daily lives. The political change, when it came, happened remarkably quickly. Soldiers from both armies were increasingly reluctant to raid communities where their own family members were now trading regularly. Military commanders found it difficult to justify attacks on cities that were providing goods their own people needed and wanted. Most importantly, the economic benefits of direct trade were so obvious that both city councils began to face pressure from their own citizens to find a way to make the commerce official and permanent. The actual peace negotiation took place, at Melina's suggestion, in Karina's farmhouse, the neutral ground that had unknowingly hosted the beginning of the change. Representatives from both cities sat at Karina's simple wooden table, sharing a meal that included olive oil from Megalopolis, wine that was definitely not from Cly, and food served in pottery that Melina had made specifically for the occasion. The treaty they signed was refreshingly straightforward. Both cities agreed to stop fighting and to establish formal trade relationships that would benefit everyone involved. Disputes would be settled through arbitration rather than warfare. Young people could choose careers in commerce and craftsmanship instead of military service. But perhaps the most important provision was the one that established an annual festival to be held at Carina's farm, celebrating the end of the war and the beginning of peaceful cooperation. The centerpiece of this festival would be a display of pottery made by artisans from both cities, including pieces created specifically to commemorate the peace. At the center of the display, in a place of honor, would be the fragments of the broken water jar that had started the entire process of reconciliation. Years later, as the children of former enemies played together in Carina's garden, while their parents traded goods and shared stories, people would often comment on how remarkable it was that such a small thing, a broken pot, could end such a long conflict. But Carina, now recognized as the unofficial patron saint of practical peacemaking, would smile and point out that it hadn't been the broken pot that ended the war. It had been the willingness to see that beneath the surface of any conflict, people usually want the same simple things: good work, fair trade, safe communities, and the chance to appreciate beauty in their daily lives. The broken pot had just made those common desires visible to people who had forgotten to look for them. That understanding of common desires beneath surface conflicts, which had ended a 30-year war over a broken pot, found its way to the island of Crete and into the heart of one of the most famous and terrible stories in all of Greek mythology: the tale of the Minotaur in his labyrinth, waiting for his tribute of young Athenian lives. But our story isn't about Theseus the hero, or Ariadne the princess with her ball of thread, or even the monster itself. It's about an old shepherd named Lycaon, who tended his flocks on the hills above King Minos' palace, and who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time to witness the end of something that had terrorized the Mediterranean world for a generation. Lycaon had been herding sheep and goats on those hills for 40 years through the reigns of 3 different kings, watching the palace below grow larger and more elaborate with each passing decade. He'd seen the construction of the great labyrinth, that maze of corridors and chambers built to contain something too dangerous to kill, but too valuable to simply release. He'd never seen the Minotaur himself, of course few people had, except for the unfortunate young people who were sent into the labyrinth as tribute, and they rarely lived to describe the experience. But Lycaon had heard the creature's voice, especially on quiet nights when the wind was blowing from the direction of the palace. Not roars or bellows, as you might expect from a monster, but something much more disturbing, a sound that was part human crying and part animal keening. The voice of a being that belonged fully to neither world. It was a sound that had haunted Lycaon's dreams for years, and he'd often wondered what it would be like to live with such terrible loneliness, trapped in a maze with no company except the occasional terrified visitor who came only to die. On the morning that would turn out to be the Minotaur's last, Lycaon was leading his flock to a grazing area on the slope that offered the best view of the palace courtyard. He'd chosen this spot not for any particular reason, but simply because the grass was good there and the sheep seemed to prefer it. As he settled into his usual routine, watching the animals, mending a torn piece of clothing, eating his simple breakfast of bread and cheese, he noticed unusual activity in the palace below. A ship had arrived during the night, clearly Athenian by its design and the pattern of its sail. This would be the tribute ship, bringing the 14 young people who would be sent into the labyrinth to feed the monster's hunger. Lycaon had seen this grim ritual many times before, and it never became easier to watch. The young Athenians would be brought up from the harbor, fed a final meal, and then led into the labyrinth's entrance, while priests chanted prayers that everyone knew were meaningless. By evening, the crying from the maze would stop, and everyone would know the tribute had been accepted. But this time felt different. Lycaon couldn't have said exactly why. Perhaps it was something in the way the guards moved, less routine and more alert than usual. Perhaps it was the fact that one of the young Athenians, a tall youth with dark hair, seemed to be talking earnestly with a Cretan princess, rather than simply accepting his fate with resignation. Or perhaps it was just that, after 40 years of watching the same tragic cycle repeat itself, Lycaon had developed an intuition for when something was about to change. As the day progressed, Lycaon found himself paying more attention to the palace than to his sheep. The animals were well trained and unlikely to wander far, so he allowed himself to become absorbed in observing the small dramas playing out in the courtyard below. He saw the Cretan princess Ariadne, He thought her name was having what looked like an intense conversation with someone who might have been the chief architect of the labyrinth. He saw guards being positioned around the maze entrance, but in a pattern that seemed designed more to keep people out than to prevent escape. Most intriguingly, he saw the young Athenian man examining the walls around the labyrinth entrance with the careful attention of someone who was planning something more complex than simply walking in and hoping for the best. As the sun began to set, the familiar ritual began. The 14 young Athenians were brought to the labyrinth entrance, and Lycon prepared himself for another night of trying not to listen to the sounds that would come from within the maze. But then something unprecedented happened. Instead of all 14 prisoners being sent into the labyrinth together, only the tall young man entered. The others were led away apparently to be held somewhere else. Lycon settled in for what he expected to be a long night of vigil. In his experience, the sounds from the labyrinth usually lasted several hours. First the noise of people trying to find their way through the maze, then the encounter with the Minotaur, then the final terrible silence. But tonight was different from the very beginning. Instead of the usual sounds of panicked running and confused shouting, Lycon heard something that sounded almost like conversation. It was impossible to make out words at this distance, but the rhythm of the sounds coming from the maze suggested two voices, not the usual pattern of human terror and animal response. This continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes the voices seemed to be moving deeper into the labyrinth, sometimes closer to the entrance. Occasionally there would be periods of silence. Then the conversation would resume, and gradually, Lycon began to realize that one of the voices was changing. The sound that had haunted his dreams for years, that terrible mixture of human sorrow and animal desperation, was still there, but it was becoming more human, less wild, more articulate, as if something that had been lost was slowly being remembered. Near dawn, the sound stopped entirely, and Lycon prepared for the usual announcement that the tribute had been accepted and the Minotaur's hunger satisfied for another year. Instead, he saw the tall young Athenian emerge from the labyrinth entrance, very much alive and apparently unharmed. Behind him came a figure Lycon had never expected to see in daylight, the Minotaur himself. But the creature that followed the young man out of the maze was not the monster Lycon had imagined during all those nights of listening to its cries. It was clearly part human and part bull. Yes, but there was something in its posture, in the way it moved, that spoke of intelligence and even dignity rather than mere animal ferocity. What happened next was even more surprising. The Minotaur didn't attack anyone. It didn't try to escape or rampage through the palace. Instead, it stood quietly beside the young Athenian, looking around at the world outside the labyrinth, as if seeing daylight for the first time in years. From his vantage point on the hillside, Lycon could see guards and officials gathering in the courtyard, clearly as surprised by this development as he was. There was a great deal of animated discussion gesturing toward the labyrinth, toward the two figures standing at its entrance, toward the harbor where the Athenian ship waited. After what seemed like hours of debate, a small procession formed. The young Athenian, the Minotaur, Princess Ariadne, and several others walked slowly toward the harbor, while crowds gathered along the route to witness this unprecedented event. Lycon left his sheep in the care of his well-trained dogs and made his way down the hillside, driven by a curiosity that had been building for hours. He needed to understand what had happened in that labyrinth, what had changed the monster into whatever it had become. By the time he reached the harbor, the Athenian ship was preparing to depart. The young man who had entered the labyrinth, Theseus, people were calling him, was standing on the dock having what appeared to be a farewell conversation with the Minotaur. Lycon positioned himself close enough to overhear part of their exchange. "Are you sure you don't want to come with us?" Theseus was asking. "Athens would welcome you. There are scholars there who would be interested in your unique perspective on things." The Minotaur's voice, when it responded, was rough from years of disuse, but unmistakably intelligent. "Thank you, but no. I've spent too many years in the dark. I need to relearn how to live in the light, and I think I should do that here, in the place where I was created." He gestured toward the palace, where King Minos could be seen watching from a high balcony. "Besides, my father and I have things to discuss. 30 years worth of things." As the Athenian ship sailed away, carrying Theseus and the 13 other young people who had been spared the usual fate of tribute prisoners, Lycon found himself walking beside the Minotaur as the creature made its way slowly back toward the palace. "Excuse me," Lycon said quietly, "but I couldn't help wondering, what happened in there, in the labyrinth?" The Minotaur paused and looked at the old shepherd with eyes that were surprisingly gentle for something with such a fearsome appearance. "Someone listened to me," he said simply. "For the first time in 30 years, someone came into that maze not to kill me or to die, but to listen. And when I remembered how to talk instead of just roar, I remembered how to think clearly again." He was quiet for a moment, looking back at the labyrinth that had been his prison and home for so long. "I was never really a monster, you know. I was just confused, angry, isolated. When you spend that long alone with your rage, it becomes hard to remember what you were angry about in the first place." Lycon nodded, thinking of the lonely nights when he'd heard those terrible cries echoing across the hills. "What would you do now? Learn how to be part of a community again, I suppose. Help my father understand that fear and isolation don't actually make kingdoms stronger, they just make everyone more miserable." The Minotaur smiled an expression that transformed his entire face and made him look more human than bull. "And maybe help design a better way to resolve conflicts than feeding young people to monsters in mazes." Years later, when Crete had become known throughout the Mediterranean, not for its terrible tribute demands, but for its innovative approaches to diplomacy and conflict resolution, visitors would often ask Lycon about the day he watched the Minotaur die, but Lycon would always correct them gently. "The Minotaur didn't die that day," he would say. "The monster died. What walked out of that labyrinth was just a person who had finally remembered how to be human again." And sometimes, late at night, when the wind was quiet and the sheep were settled peacefully in their fold, Lycon would remember the sound of those voices in the labyrinth, two people talking to each other across the space between their different kinds of loneliness, finding their way toward understanding in the darkness, teaching each other how to live in the light. That lesson about finding understanding across different kinds of loneliness, which had transformed a monster back into a person in the depths of a Cretan labyrinth, found its way to the bustling agora of Athens, where it settled into the most unlikely of places. A small vegetable stall run by a former slave named Zeno, who had developed an unusual approach to settling disputes. Zeno's stall was nothing special to look at: a simple wooden table covered with whatever vegetables were in season, a few baskets for storing produce, and a small stool where he could sit during the slow parts of the day. What made it remarkable was that people from all over Athens came there not just to buy onions and turnips, but to ask Zeno to help them resolve arguments they couldn't settle on their own. This had started entirely by accident. Zeno had been a slave for most of his adult life, owned by a series of masters who had used his intelligence for managing household accounts and mediating disputes between other slaves. He developed a reputation for fairness and practical wisdom, qualities that had eventually earned him his freedom when his final master decided that owning such a person was morally uncomfortable. The first time someone asked for Zeno's intervention, it was simply because his stall happened to be located between two fishmongers who were having a loud disagreement about whose responsibility it was to clean up the area where their businesses met. With his freedom came the need to earn a living, and vegetables seemed like a straightforward business. You bought produce from farmers in the morning, sold it to city dwellers during the day, and tried to avoid losing money on anything that spoiled before you could find a customer for it. But Athens was a city where everyone had opinions about everything, and the agora was where those opinions collided most frequently. Customers arguing about prices, vendors disputing the boundaries of their selling spaces, neighbors feuding over everything from borrowed tools to wandering chickens. Conflicts erupted regularly throughout the marketplace. "You settle this," one of them said to Zeno, apparently assuming that anyone who could maintain such neat piles of vegetables must have good judgment about boundaries and responsibilities. Zeno could have declined, it wasn't his problem, and he had his own business to tend. But the arguing was disturbing his customers, and he could see that both fishmongers were reasonable people who had simply gotten locked into positions they couldn't retreat from without losing face. So he listened to both sides, asked a few questions about how other vendor pairs handled similar situations, and suggested a solution that was so obviously fair that both men agreed to it immediately. Word of this successful mediation spread quickly through the Agora's informal communication network, and within a few weeks people were regularly approaching Zeno with disputes they wanted him to help resolve. Having been a slave, he understood what it felt like to have no power in a conflict, which made him sympathetic to people who felt overwhelmed by more powerful opponents. Having managed complex household affairs, he was skilled at finding practical solutions to problems that seemed impossibly complicated. And having lived among people from many different backgrounds, he'd learned to recognize the common human needs that underlie most disagreements. He discovered that he enjoyed this work almost as much as he enjoyed selling vegetables, and that his unusual background gave him advantages that more traditional arbitrators lacked. Most importantly, he developed what he called the vegetable seller's approach to conflict resolution. When someone comes to buy onions, he would explain to people who asked about his methods, they don't really want onions. They want to make soup, or flavor a stew, or prepare a meal that will bring their family together around a table. The onions are just the tool they need to get what they actually want. Same thing with arguments. People don't really want to win fights. They want to feel respected, or secure, or understood. The argument is just the tool they're using to try to get those deeper needs met. A typical case might involve two neighbors arguing about a property line. Traditional arbitration would focus on surveys, deeds, and legal precedents to determine the exact boundary. Zeno would ask what each neighbor was hoping to do with the disputed space, then look for solutions that allowed both people to accomplish their goals without necessarily resolving the technical question of ownership. This perspective led him to ask different questions than most arbitrators would ask. Instead of focusing on who was right and who was wrong, he tried to understand what each person actually needed to feel satisfied with the resolution. Often these creative solutions worked better than strict legal judgments would have, because they addressed the real problems people were facing, rather than just the formal complaints they were making. But the case that changed Athenian law began with something much more serious than property lines or market disputes. A wealthy merchant named Hippias had accused a young potter named Clemenes of stealing valuable silver coins from his house during a dinner party. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Clemenes had been in the room where the money was kept. He'd left the party early without much explanation, and the coins had been discovered missing the next morning. Under Athenian law, theft of that amount would result in severe punishment, possibly death, certainly exile and financial ruin. But Clemenes insisted he was innocent, and several people who knew him well found it hard to believe he would risk everything for money when his pottery business was doing well enough to support his family comfortably. When both men arrived at the vegetable stall, clearly uncomfortable with each other and with the situation, Zeno made an unusual request. The case was complicated by social tensions. Hippias was wealthy, well-connected, and used to getting his way. Clemenes was respectable but not powerful, and he couldn't afford the kind of legal representation that might have helped him challenge the evidence effectively. Hippias could have taken the matter directly to the courts, where his social status and the apparent evidence would almost certainly have resulted in a conviction. But someone, possibly his own wife, who had doubts about the accusation, suggested that he might first consult with Zeno, who had developed a reputation for uncovering aspects of disputes that weren't immediately obvious. Before we talk about what happened, Zeno said, let me understand what each of you needs to feel this matter has been resolved fairly. Clemenes was more hesitant. I need people to know I'm not a thief. My reputation is all I have. If people think I steal, my business dies and my family suffers. Hippias answered first, as wealthy people often do. I need my property returned. And I need assurance that people can't steal from me without consequences. Zeno nodded thoughtfully. So you need your silver back, he said to Hippias, and you need your reputation intact, he said to Clemenes. What if we could accomplish both of those things without necessarily determining whether a theft actually occurred? Both men looked puzzled, so Zeno continued. Hippias, tell me about the dinner party. Who was there? What happened? When did you discover the money was missing? When did you last count the silver before the party? Most intriguingly, the missing coins were discovered the morning after the party. But Hippias couldn't remember exactly when he'd last checked to make sure they were still there. As the story emerged, several interesting details became clear. The dinner party had been large and boisterous, with many guests moving freely through Hippias's house. The silver coins had been kept in a wooden box in a room used for storing cloaks and other personal items during the party. Several people had been in and out of that room throughout the evening. I suppose that's possible. Hippias had to think about it. I'm not certain. It might have been several days earlier, maybe a week. So, the coins could have gone missing before the party even happened. And during the party, many people had access to the room where the coins were kept. Yes, Hippias admitted, but Clemenes was the only one who left early. This was where Zeno's experience as a former slave became valuable. He understood household dynamics in ways that free citizens often didn't, and he knew to ask questions others might overlook. Well, there were several, Hippias said, but I trust my household staff completely. I'm sure you do, Zeno replied calmly. But trust and opportunity are different things. Could someone have taken the coins before the party, with the theft only discovered afterward when you checked the box? Who else had access to your house in the days before the party? Servants, tradespeople, delivery workers? Zeno summarized. We have missing silver that could have disappeared at any time during a week-long period when many people had access to it. We have a suspect whose early departure from the party had nothing to do with theft. And we have two people whose real needs, security and reputation, don't actually require us to determine guilt or innocence with absolute certainty. As they explored this possibility, a different picture began to emerge. Hippias's house had indeed been busier than usual in the days before the party, with additional workers brought in to help with preparations. The room where the silver was kept had been used for storing extra supplies and equipment. Most significantly, when Zeno asked detailed questions about Clemenes' behavior at the party, it became clear that the potter had left early, not because he was fleeing with stolen goods, but because he'd felt uncomfortable in the social gathering and had used a family obligation as a polite excuse to depart. The solution Zeno proposed was characteristically practical. Clemenes would create a special piece of pottery for Hippias, something valuable and beautiful, that would serve both as an apology for the suspicion and a demonstration of goodwill. Hippias would publicly acknowledge that the evidence against Clemenes was not conclusive, clearing the potter's reputation, and both men would work together to establish better security practices to prevent similar incidents in the future. Both agreed to the resolution, which addressed their real concerns without requiring anyone to admit wrongdoing or lose face publicly. But the case had attracted attention from Athenian legal scholars, intrigued by Zeno's approach to a problem that the formal court system would have handled much more rigidly and probably less satisfactorily. The law that eventually passed was based directly on Zeno's methods and philosophy. It recognized that not all conflicts need to be resolved through formal determinations of guilt and innocence, and that creative solutions often serve everyone's interests better than rigid applications of legal precedent. Within months, the Assembly was debating a proposal to establish a new category of legal procedure: voluntary mediation, allowing disputing parties to seek resolution through trained arbitrators before or instead of going to court. The law isn't something that should exist separately from daily life, Zeno would explain. It should grow out of how people actually need to live together, like vegetables growing from soil that's been properly tended. Now recognized as one of the city's most skilled mediators while still selling the occasional turnip, Zeno would smile and point out that the best solutions usually come from places where people meet as equals to solve practical problems. Years later, when Athens had become famous throughout Greece for its innovative approach to dispute resolution, visitors would often express surprise that such an important legal reform had originated in a vegetable stall in the agora. And perhaps that's the most beautiful truth of all, that justice, like good vegetables, grows best when it's rooted in the real conditions where people live, and tended by those who understand that the goal isn't to win arguments, but to help communities thrive. That understanding of justice, something that grows from real conditions where people live, which had transformed Athenian law through a vegetable seller's wisdom, found its way to the most unexpected place of all. The workshop of a sculptor who worked with the woman everyone called Medusa, back when she was still just a person with beautiful hair and a talent for holding very, very still. This was long before the curse, before the snakes, before heroes came seeking her head as a trophy. In those days, Medusa was simply a young woman who lived on a small island near the coast of what would someday be called Libya. She made her living as a model for an elderly sculptor named Alexios, who specialized in portrait busts for wealthy clients. Alexios had discovered early in his career that the secret to successful portrait sculpture wasn't just technical skill with marble and bronze brands. Though that was important, but finding models who could capture and hold the exact expression the client wanted to see immortalized in stone. Most people, when asked to pose for a sculpture, became self-conscious and stiff. They would try to arrange their features into what they thought looked noble or attractive, with the result that every portrait ended up looking artificially posed and lifeless. But Medusa had a gift Alexios had never encountered before. She could become completely still while maintaining a completely natural expression. More than that, she could hold different expressions for hours at a time, allowing him to capture subtle variations in mood and personality that brought his sculptures to life. She could pose as a stern matron, a playful young woman, a wise grandmother, or a determined warrior, and each character would be so convincing that clients often forgot they were looking at the same model who would pose for their neighbor's completely different portrait. But Medusa's real talent, the one that made her invaluable to Alexios, was her ability to look directly at people without making them uncomfortable. This might not sound like much, but anyone who has ever tried to maintain eye contact during a conversation knows how challenging it can be. Most people look away, glance around, or focus on something just over the other person's shoulder. Sustained direct eye contact feels intense, sometimes even threatening. Medusa could look steadily at someone for hours without any of that awkwardness. Her gaze was calm, interested, complete and present, the way you might look at a beautiful sunset or a fascinating piece of art. People felt seen by her, but not judged or challenged. This made her particularly valuable for portrait work, because clients would relax under her steady gaze and reveal their true personalities, which Alexios could then capture in the stone. The arrangement worked beautifully for several years until the day a client arrived who would change everything. His name was Poseidon, and he claimed to be a sea captain, though there was something about him that suggested he was accustomed to more authority than most ship captains wielded. He wanted a portrait bust made, he said, as a gift for a temple he was helping to fund. The commission itself was straightforward enough. Poseidon wanted to be portrayed in a heroic style, strong, noble, commanding respect. Alexios had created dozens of such portraits over the years, but from the beginning, the sessions were uncomfortable. Poseidon seemed less interested in the portrait than in Medusa herself. He would interrupt the work to talk to her, to ask personal questions, to suggest that she might enjoy a more exciting life than modeling for sculptures on a small island. Medusa handled these interruptions with the same calm professionalism she brought to everything else. She would answer politely but briefly, then return her attention to holding the pose Alexios needed for his work. But Poseidon's behavior grew more persistent and inappropriate with each session. He began arriving early and staying late, trying to monopolize Medusa's time. He brought expensive gifts that she politely declined. He made suggestions about places they could visit together, opportunities he could provide for her in other cities. Finally, he made his intentions completely clear. He wanted Medusa to leave with him, to become his companion, to abandon her quiet life for whatever adventures he could offer. When she declined firmly but respectfully, his demeanor changed entirely. The man who had presented himself as charming and generous revealed himself to be someone who didn't accept refusal gracefully. He became angry, then threatening, then, in a moment that would haunt Medusa for the rest of her life, violent. What happened next in Alexios' workshop was an assault that left Medusa traumatized and Poseidon feeling powerful and entitled. When it was over, he left as if nothing significant had occurred, promising to return the next day to continue the portrait sessions. but the real horror was yet to come. That night, as Medusa tried to process what had happened to her, another visitor arrived at the workshop, a woman who introduced herself as Athena, claiming to represent the temple where Poseidon's portrait was supposedly destined. Instead of offering sympathy or support to a young woman who had been victimized, Athena brought accusations and blame. Medusa had tempted a holy man, she claimed. Medusa had used her beauty and her unusual gaze to seduce someone who should have been focused on sacred duties. Medusa was responsible for the violation of temple sanctity that had occurred. The punishment Athena imposed was cruel and precisely calculated. Medusa's beautiful hair, her pride and her most distinctive feature, would become a writhing mass of snakes. Her gift for comfortable, sustained eye contact would become a curse that turned anyone who met her gaze directly into stone. She would live in isolation, feared and avoided, a monster whose very presence reminded everyone of the terrible consequences of tempting the gods. But here's what the stories never tell you about the years that followed. Medusa didn't become a mindless monster. She remained intelligent, thoughtful, and deeply sad about what her life had become. She moved to a remote cave to protect others from her cursed gaze. But she didn't stop thinking, or remembering, or trying to understand what had happened to her. And Andrikos, horrified by what had occurred in his workshop, and furious at the injustice of Medusa's punishment, didn't abandon her. He was too old to relocate to her cave, but he found ways to maintain contact. He would leave supplies outside her dwelling. Food, blankets, materials for the simple crafts that helped her pass the lonely hours. More importantly, he would leave messages scratched on pottery shards or carved into pieces of wood. These messages weren't just practical communications, they were conversations carried on slowly, over months and years, about art, philosophy, justice, and the nature of divine punishment. Through these exchanges, Medusa began to develop a perspective on her situation that was both tragic and profound. She had been transformed into a monster, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had been the victim of someone powerful who faced no consequences for his actions. Her punishment served not to protect justice, but to protect the reputation of gods who preferred to blame victims rather than hold their favorites accountable. But she also realized that her curse, terrible as it was, had given her a different kind of power. Anyone who looked directly at her would turn to stone. Yes, but this meant she could defend herself in ways she never could before. No one could assault her now, or threaten her, or force her to do anything against her will. The isolation was painful, but it was also a kind of freedom from the expectations and demands society placed on young women. More than that, she began to understand that her story, the real story, not the version that painted her as a temptress who got what she deserved, was important for other women to hear. Through Andrikos, she began to share that story not as a victim seeking pity, but as someone who had learned hard truths about power, justice, and the ways societies protect the guilty by blaming the innocent. Her messages, copied and shared through networks of people who were interested in real justice rather than official mythology, began to influence how some communities thought about assault, punishment, and responsibility. When Medusa was finally killed by Perseus, who came seeking her head as a trophy for his own heroic reputation, she faced her death with a kind of peace that surprised everyone who had expected to find a raging monster. Her final message, delivered through Andrikos to anyone who cared to listen, was simple but revolutionary. I was never the monster in this story. I was just the person who got blamed for someone else's choices. Remember that. When you hear tales of heroes and monsters, ask yourself, who really had the power? Who really made the choices? And who paid the price? Years later, when people told stories about Medusa the monster, Andrikos would quietly share the real story about a young woman who had been turned into a symbol of everything that was wrong with how powerful people avoided consequences for their actions. And sometimes, very quietly, people would listen and understand that the most important truths are often found not in the stories everyone knows, but in the experiences of those who lived through events the stories prefer to forget. The real Medusa had been a woman who could look steadily at truth without flinching, who could hold difficult realities in her gaze until others were ready to see them clearly. In the end, Perhaps that was the most frightening thing about her, not that she could turn people to stone, but that she could help them see the world as it really was, rather than as they preferred to imagine it. And as you drift towards sleep tonight, carried by these gentle stories of ancient wisdom and quiet truths, perhaps you can rest with the knowledge that even in the darkest tales, there are always people working patiently toward understanding, toward justice, toward the kind of truth that emerges when we're brave enough to listen to voices others prefer to silence.